Recently, I made a video in which I, a Protestant, made the best case that I could, or at least the way that I would make it for the Orthodox Church if I were Orthodox. It was a really fun experience, and in it, I tried to take on a bit of a different persona insofar as I see like what the best of Orthodoxy is. And people might have picked up on some people it was inspired by, and to the extent that they have guessed, they were probably right, but I won't weigh in on that today. In any case, though, in today's video, I'm going to be responding to that because despite the strength, I think, of this video, I am still not Orthodox. And why is that? That's what I'm going to be discussing today. I will say, though, like the Catholic response that I did, or the response to the video I made arguing for the Catholic Church, this one is even more difficult because it lacks a lot of concrete claims. Like if you're going to make a rebuttal video, you need someone to put forth an argument that you can then seek to show that it's arguing either not against the position you hold or that it makes some mistake in trying to argue against that position and fails to actually overcome the original argument. The problem is that this one doesn't do that a lot. It's kind of like a vibes-based video, and that was somewhat intentional because I do think that Orthodoxy can often take a form, at least in the way that I articulate it here, that is a bit more noumenal, a bit harder to pin down. It often trades on ideas of mystery in particular that make it difficult to say like it is this and not that. That can be one of its most alluring, most exciting things, that it feels kind of less rationalistic, less so kind of, it'll be caricatured against like a Western scholastic method, which I don't think is entirely fair, but it can be intriguing and exciting. And you add the words mystery to a lot of incense and smoke and people dress differently. And like, it's a vibe. But that it's hard to argue against vibes, right? And so I want to point out kind of one area this shows up early on, and it's in a quote that I pull from Philip Sherrard about what the church is. Here is that. We have become so used to regarding the church, if not as a simple building within which men and women gather in order to worship God, then as an institution organized very much along the lines of any other human institution or society, that we tend to forget that its essential reality is quite different. We tend to forget that in the first place, the church is a spiritual reality rooted in divine life. Thus, we must not treat the church as a mere social phenomenon that we can investigate crassly, placing ourselves in the position of judge or jury. To do so would be to judge Christ himself. So here early on, I want to make a distinction. On the one hand, I think it's totally fair to talk about mystery being part of the Christian faith, being part of the Orthodox tradition especially. And that's totally fine. But there's a difference between saying something is a mystery as kind of a rhetorical hand-waving to say you can't pin down our argument so you can't argue against it, and saying here's what we know, but the circle of what we don't know is a lot larger than that. But we do have like an entry into this. It's a bit like looking at a giant cave, perhaps, and saying like, this is the right cave, and we know something about this, but we also like don't know how to reach the deep recesses of the cave. That's one thing versus looking at like a whole mountain and being like, it's somewhere over there, but who knows, it's really cloudy. So I think we want to kind of distinguish that because I think at times mystery can be used as a rhetorical trick when we're in a difficult position and we just like throw up our hands and like, it's a mystery. Sometimes it's a mystery. Sometimes, it's a contradiction. And look, I think Christians in general have a tendency to do this. I tend to think, and this isn't Orthodox specific, but that the line between like sophistry and great insight can be quite thin at times, because on the one hand we say like, oh, it's such a deep paradox, and on the other hand someone can look at it and say it's a contradiction, and sometimes that's just a difference of mentality or a difference of approach, or it's a difference of what we want to be true. And so while I'm not saying that all truth has to be analytical in nature, we do want to be careful that we're not kind of special pleading under the guise of mystery. And to be fair to Orthodox Austin, he does make a distinction between the immanent church and the transcendent church, and that, we can't pin down kind of some of the transcendent aspects of the faith, but it's incarnational, just as Christ is human and divine in one person. So too, the church has human and divine elements in one institution. And so I think, Orthodox Austin tries to push through this, and he does an okay job of it, but I'm just flagging that in general as we think about these types of arguments. Second thing I want to look at, though, is a comment that is made in the video about salvation outside the church. It becomes a tautology that salvation is found in the church, and outside the church there is no salvation, because the church is Christ and he is our salvation. This is not to make commentary on the salvation of individual souls. The Orthodox Church does not say who is and who is not saved at the level of each person. We know that Christ is present in his church because the church is his body. But is that to say that he cannot work in ways that are unseen? Of course not. We simply cannot judge when, how, and with what frequency this happens. So if you've been following my content, you know that the teaching of that there is no salvation outside of the church is one of my big gripes with both the Orthodox and Catholic traditions. And it's interesting then that in the Protestants' case for Orthodoxy, Orthodox Austin really downplays this. That's intentional because, that's how I would do it if I became Orthodox. I would be much more vague about who can be saved and who cannot be. Which, on the one hand, is a very Orthodox response in that there's a lot of Orthodox people who respond in that way. However, my contention personally would be that I'm not entirely convinced that's a fully Orthodox in both kind of like the uppercase and lower, well, mainly in the uppercase sense, response. It does seem that there are kind of two streams of thought within the Orthodox tradition that haven't been fully reconciled with one another, and maybe they can be, maybe they can't be. Here's what I mean. On the one hand, you do have streams of thought within the Orthodox tradition that can be a bit more juridical, a bit more exclusivist, that can be a bit more rigid, might we say, in defining what the church is and really being strong about there is only one church. Outside of that, there is no salvation under normal circumstances. And I think we see this coming out in really multiple ages of the church, though I think it has been softened more recently, except in online types of circles and in more kind of hyper Orthodox converts especially. I think this is making a real resurgence. But generally speaking, at the popular level, I think there's been this separate stream that on the one hand can be a bit more kind of vague about hey, we know where the church is, but we don't know where it's not. We know where the Spirit is, but we don't know where the Spirit is not. We see people like Callisto, the late Metropolitan Callistos Ware talking in this way. But then even within this stream, or kind of a third stream we might point out, is that there, I would contend, has been a real universalist stream in the Orthodox Church, both throughout its whole history as well. I know it's somewhat disputed, not so much in the scholarly circles, about Gregory of Nyssa being a universalist. We could say Maximus the Confessor. Similarly, many people would interpret him as being a universalist, or at least his theology having strong universalistic implications if we take it to its logical conclusions. If we fast forward a lot of time, if you look at kind of the Russian Sophiologists, or kind of Russian Orthodoxy in general in the Russian Silver Age, with people like Bulgakov and Berdyaev, the latter of whom shows up a lot in this video, again, we have strong streams of universalism. I don't think those things have been fully reconciled within the church, but it does seem that at a more authoritative level, and probably more widespread, we do have a more exclusivistic reading. And so a comment I would have generally about this video, I gestured to it because it's up on the screen here, the Protestant's case for Orthodoxy, is that if that's what Orthodoxy is, I think it is absolutely beautiful. I love that expression of Orthodoxy. And recently I wrote an article on Substack, which is probably my most kind of vulnerable appraisal of Orthodoxy, in which I say that I think Orthodoxy is a beautiful expression of the faith, perhaps the most beautiful expression of the Christian faith, but I have a hard time seeing it as the only expression of the faith. I'll touch more on this later when we talk about the saints, but insofar as you can have a really generous and broad Orthodoxy as proposed here that sees Orthodoxy as this beautiful path, but not, exhaustive of the whole Christian tradition, I would say I love that, and I could probably be that tomorrow. My problem, personally, is I still don't see, despite having people try to nuance what anathema is and what it means, I can't imagine myself in good faith ever reading the anathemas on Orthodox Sunday and believing it. And to be in that situation just feels like, then why would you become Orthodox? Because like that's the triumph of Orthodoxy that you're reading these. And for me, I don't think I could do that in good faith. And so despite finding the Orthodox tradition absolutely beautiful and pulling on my heart so strongly, and having had it influence me in such profound ways, I just don't know how to be Orthodox in good conscience. And I feel like Protestant or Orthodox Austin here has just kind of like sidestepped that issue of exclusivity, probably by choosing to interpret Orthodoxy through figures like Berdyaev, Maximus, and Nyssa, which maybe is fine. I don't know. That's something that I'm still working through. And if you're Orthodox, I would love to hear what you think. Like, is Orthodox Austin, if he's interpreting Orthodoxy through kind of like the Russian sophiologists and a much more expansive stream of Orthodoxy, like, is he a heretic? That's what I want to hear your thoughts on. But let's continue a little bit through the video. In another segment that I think is going to capture, again, maybe this question of like, is Orthodox Austin even Orthodox? That has to do with the church and its hierarchy. Through history, we see a theme. The Bishop of Rome does make increasingly grand claims about himself, and the churches in the East largely ignore this. Sometimes they give in to it when it's convenient, or at other times they push back strongly when they disagree. And all of this is to be expected, after all. The church, though tied to its hierarchy, is not synonymous with the hierarchy, and we shouldn't expect a pristine church from the vantage of how its leaders act during various historical contingencies. The fact of the matter is that church history can be messy at times. It's a story of many schisms. It's a story of often warring powers within the church, but that these things get settled at the ecumenical councils, and importantly, we see a continuity in the liturgy and the spirit of these churches. So here, once again, I find that Orthodox Austin concedes a lot of ground to what I would consider primarily like more Protestant interpretations of history. Within the context of the video, I'm kind of arguing against papal primacy. And it was something I had to do a bit in this video because I think to be Orthodox, one does have to kind of wrestle with the Catholic claims, because for the most part, the arguments that get you to Catholicism and Orthodoxy are very similar, with the papacy being really the linchpin issue that's going to cause you to go one way or the other, at least in most cases. And so within that, I'm talking about like, hey, sometimes the Orthodox do seem to accept papal claims and other times they don't. Now, and I say like, look, and that's just history. Like, history's messy, but look, we solved it at the ecumenical councils. I would say, one, this view does seem to kind of like really lean into the fact that history is messy. Sometimes people got things wrong. That might be a bit uncomfortable for some Orthodox. But the criticism I might have a step further is to say that it all kind of gets solved at the ecumenical councils, I think actually can create more problems. Because even embedded within the ecumenical councils, we do have at times a very high kind of pro-papal view that shows up in seemingly authoritative places. And I would take Eric Ibarra's argument here to be a fairly decent one, that, you know, the trouble for the Catholics is that they claim something like papal infallibility. And at times it seems like we have within the tradition, the popes being told they're heretics, or these things happening that don't seem to align with papal infallibility. But his criticism to the Orthodox is, if you're going to say that kind of like the ecumenical councils are infallible, then that kind of like snuck in the back door are some really serious papal claims that you have to deal with. So I'm not sure that Orthodox Austin has this fully figured out, but if he wants to take that line of reasoning that church history is messy and apply it even to something like the ecumenical councils, to say like, okay, but when they talk about the Pope, you know, maybe we don't have to worry too much, or maybe not even when they talk about the Pope, but their general attitude toward the Pope. I think that's going to be ceding a lot of historical ground that I think Orthodox Austin, having known him, would be okay with. He's okay with not making these like analytic arguments from history for the Orthodox Church. But it is going to be a thing that, again, I ask you Orthodox, like, is Orthodox Austin a heretic? Let's move on a little further, though, to talk about the next layer of the argument, which was the argument from the saints. Basically, what I'm saying in this part of the video is that one of the great kind of testament to the truth of Orthodoxy is the consistency in the spiritual experience as seen through the saints. I say, like, look, if you love the Desert Fathers and the Church Fathers, that same spirit is alive in the Orthodox Church and has been throughout history in a consistent way that just isn't seen in other churches. I would bracket off like the Oriental Orthodox churches here because I think they might have an even better claim to at least the spirit of the Desert Fathers. But if we want to bracket that off, and Orthodox Austin would be very pro-ecumenical with the Oriental Orthodox, another reason you might call him a heretic. But that aside, I do think that his general point that like the spirit of the saints in the Catholic Church is a lot more diverse and in maybe troubling ways. If we're expecting them to all be experiencing union with God, we might expect more uniform things to come out of this. Let me kind of cede the floor to Orthodox Austin so that you can hear how he puts that. Of all the forms of Christianity, it is the Orthodox Church which has remained the most closely tied to early Christianity. The strength of the internal tradition in the church is the strength of the spiritual experience and the continuity of the spiritual path, the power of super-personal spiritual life, in which every generation shakes off feelings of self-satisfaction and exclusivity and is united with the spiritual life of preceding generations extending back to the apostles. In this tradition, I have the same experience of and the same sagacity as the Apostle Paul, the martyrs, the saints, and the whole Christian world. In tradition, my knowledge is not only personal, but also super-personal, and I live not in isolation, but in the body of Christ, in a single spiritual organism with all my brothers in Christ. So again, that quote comes from Nikolai Berdyaev, who spans kind of 19th, 20th century Russia. He's a great Russian Orthodox thinker, and he's talking about the consistency of the spiritual experience. Again, a point that I would grant. However, it's worth putting in here kind of a couple things. One, I think there is this consistency, which is really good, but also speaks to kind of a limit of the Orthodox Church as well. And Berdyaev is actually, he notes this in the context. It's his argument. I think the article is something like the truth of Orthodoxy. But he's actually saying that the Orthodox Church needs the West, and that he sees there being positive goods in Catholicism and Protestantism, and that the Orthodox Church has been kind of insular in a way that has helped it maintain this unity of tradition and experience, but has limited it in being able to kind of go out and meet the world. What he wants to see is not a secularization of the church, but kind of the church impacting the world. And he thinks the Orthodox Church hasn't done that too well, a point which I would pretty much grant with him. And this point generally brings me back to a comment that I thought was really, really enlightening in an interview that I had with Father Laurent Kleinowirk, an Orthodox priest. And he said that Orthodoxy is essentially Christianity as taught and received through St. Basil and St. Chrysostom. I found this to be kind of like an astonishing thing to say as an Orthodox priest. And I'm not going to kind of like hold him to it. He might have nuance on how he would say this, but that's how I see the Orthodox Church, that it is Christianity as taught and kind of experienced and received through those figures, like specifically the Cappadocians, Chrysostom, etc., which I think is a beautiful form of it. And again, perhaps maybe the best form of Christianity. But that's a very different claim than saying it's the only true one outside of which there is no salvation or no sacraments or things of this nature. I think that Christianity, as it developed in many different ways. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think we should simultaneously want kind of like variation and expression to match the local place, that Christianity is always going to be encountering, affecting, and affected by the cultures in which it is taking root and flourishing. And I think that's a good thing, actually. I think it's part of what makes Christianity, Catholic and universal in this way, and going out and reaching all peoples. And, Paul talking about like to the Jews, or Jew to the Gentiles, etc., like to be able to be adaptable in that way. And so I think the strength of Orthodoxy and its kind of unity of experience and expression and all of these things comes at the cost of it being at times kind of a narrow expression of what Christianity is. Now, of course, that's not, I do want to leave space to say that, of course, the Orthodox faith does have different expressions. If you go to Russia versus you go to, say, Jerusalem, or in any number of places. Like you have all of these different jurisdictions and patriarchates, and they are going to have differences. But I do wonder if, the strength of this argument that like, hey, they all look the same, it can simultaneously be a weakness at times. Because the fact of the matter is, even at the time of Basil and Chrysostom, the expression of Christianity was a lot more diverse. And this is why I actually think that something like the Western Rite Orthodox parishes are doing a really good thing. Because if Orthodoxy is to be Catholic, it can't just be Eastern. And it can't say that everything West is bad. To do so, I think is really to limit the work of the Spirit in history and to, again, be a bit too insular. Now, engaging the world is always going to have you be affected by it while you're affecting it. And so that's a scary thing. And I know that Orthodoxy has really wanted to maintain what it is, and I'm grateful that it has. But this point on the saints, all this to say, it's both a strength and I think a weakness. A little later on in the video, I talk about the liturgy as a great argument for the Orthodox Church, and I'm not really going to try to rebut this. I mean, you're 20 minutes in. I'm not really rebutting anything as much as saying that I'm not sure how orthodox this whole thing is. But yeah, I think the Orthodox have an absolutely beautiful liturgy. I wouldn't say it's like the only beautiful liturgy. I think if you've ever been to like an Anglo-Catholic liturgy, I think it's phenomenal as well. And I think that's something that is being seen in more of the Western Rite parishes, is that there is a Western liturgical tradition that is beautiful and good and worthwhile. Same with a traditional Latin Mass. But the idea that the Orthodox have preserved the liturgy the best, and that God is encountered in the liturgy, and the specific point that I make of you can't really divorce liturgy from theology, I do think is a good one. And so for all those points, I would just kind of cede to Orthodox Austin. Like, yeah, good arguments, or at least good points. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most true, but I think, the beautiful as a transcendental is pointing towards something there. The final note that I want to wrap up with goes back to this figure that I've been quoting throughout, which is Nikolai Berdyaev, who has been a huge theological influence of mine. And I quote him at the very end of the video where he says this. But I want to go back to Berdyaev for a moment to remind you with his words. Orthodoxy cannot be known through surviving theological tracts and is expressed least of all in concepts. It can be known only through the life of the church and the church's people. I go on from this to say that this isn't really an intellectual exercise in proving the church, which is where I started the video as well. And on the one hand, I want to say look, yeah, there's an idea that truth is participatory. I had a interview with an Orthodox theologian on this very matter, that we know things by encountering them and participating in the life of them, and it's not just matters of the head. But there are also claims being made, unless we are to say that Orthodoxy is just a way of life, which I might be fine with saying, if we're going to say that, though, it's making positive doctrinal claims, we should be able to investigate those. And I don't think knowledge is so subjective that we can only know it in these certain ways, because it would make it for a rather odd thing. How could anyone ever convert then? All the converts would have to not know the truth before converting, which would be a bit odd. But the other thing, just on the theme of whether Orthodox Austin is Austin, it's worth pointing out that Berdyaev, this figure that I quote throughout the video, who I think expresses Orthodoxy at perhaps its best, had a really rocky relationship with the hierarchy of the church. He was often kind of on the edge of orthodoxy and was ruffling a lot of feathers along the way. And I feel like Orthodox Austin would do that same thing. And again, it just feels odd to say, should one enter a tradition knowing that they're probably going to be at odds on various things and expressing it in a way that some might find really difficult? I think Berdyaev was wonderful, and because he kind of was in an already Orthodox place, I think it made sense to maintain that orthodoxy, but in a way that he saw as most good, true, and beautiful. But I do always tend to think that the bar of converting versus staying in something is a bit different. And so I wouldn't want to kind of do an injustice to the Orthodox Church to come in and be expressing it in this way, if that's not truly Orthodox. And so after 26 minutes, I'm going to just keep saying the same thing. I thought this case was really fun. It was really interesting to make. I had a lot of fun kind of embodying Orthodox Austin. And I'd love one day to be able to say that like all of Orthodox Austin's views are true and good, and actually Orthodox. But that's my biggest hang up there, is that I'm not sure they really are. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless.